The most influential avant-garde group in interwar Czechoslovakia, Devětsil, called for a social revolution enacted at the printing press. Founded in 1920 and comprised of leftist artists, architects, actors, and poets, the group undertook an ambitious publishing effort, aiming to reach the urban individual on the street and in their homes in the years following the First World War. Across Europe in the 1920s, periodicals were a major mode through which the interwar avant-garde built networks and exchanged images and ideas. For this talk, I draw from different sections of my current book manuscript titled Technologies for the Revolution, the Czech Avant-Garde in Print, as I center the role of typography and graphic design in the avant-garde project through a consideration of newly available technologies and the ways in which artists and professional print practitioners collaborated in order to express their vision. I consider the economic factors and labor practices in 1920s Czechoslovakia that made these publications possible, as well as look to their limits. Next slide, please. From its inception, it was an urgent task of Devětsil to establish its own independent publishing platforms. This was first accomplished in late 1922 with the production of two hefty anthologies, Život or Life and Revoluční sborník Devětsil, the Revolutionary Anthology of Devětsil, each weighing in at over 200 pages, amply illustrated and including essays, poetry, and fiction by Czech as well as international, though primarily European, contributors. Both anthologies include reproductions of paintings, sculpture, drawings, architectural plans, and photographs, as well as theoretical texts, poetry, and prose that together indicate the early inclinations of Devětsil that would coalesce into the Art of Life program of poetism, as would first be articulated in the first Poetism Manifesto 2 years later. The next slide, please. The publication of a slim volume of poetry by Konstantin Bibel, with the boat that carries tea and coffee, Slodiež dováží čaj a kávu, that includes typographic montages by Karel Tajge, encapsulates a later and more codified manifestation of poetism. In all these publications, the graphic design and page layout simultaneously indicate a sophisticated understanding of new typography principles and a desire to put forth a synthetic publication, to present material textually and visually, and ultimately non-hierarchically. Typography was one of the major sites in which figures like Tajge could explore the limits of art making in a world of rapidly developing technologies, and he was taking his cue in some respects from the thinking of such artists as typographers Laszlo Moholy-Nagy and Ella Zitsky. Tajge, a leading figure within Devětsil who worked simultaneously as an artist and designer, writer, and editor on these publications, aimed with his colleagues to signal the active engagement of the group within a transnational artistic dialogue through their own graphic production and by publishing an internationally curated set of texts and images, even creating a network of exchange of images for reproduction. And the role of the printer was integral in manifesting these aims. Next slide, please. Was largely under the editorial control of the architect Jaromír Krejcar, conceived as a visual arts publication in parallel to what would supposedly be a more literary anthology, the Revoluční sborník Devětsil, edited by Tajge and the poet Jaroslav Seifert. Both anthologies were published shortly after Tajge's first trip to Paris and bear witness to the major influence that this travel had on the early articulations of Devětsil, evincing the direct results that came from establishing contacts in Paris and working to develop a broader network of international peers through publication. Next slide, please. In a letter to Seifert, dated June 25, 1922, while Tajge was on his first trip to Paris, he writes to check in on the progress of the Revoluční sborník and mentions that he is attempting to acquire štočky, which is the Czech word for what might be translated as process blocks. In English, it's also familiar as clichés in French or German, and is essentially the block from which an image was letterpress printed. So he's requesting them from artists in Paris for the reproduction of images in the anthology. If we look across Revoluční sborník and Život, we can find several credits of process blocks from lenders in Paris. 3 come from the art dealer Paul Rosenberg of works by Roger Bizier and Marie Blanchard. A work by André Derain comes from the collection of another dealer, Paul Guillaume, and a painting of Moise Kiesling from the collection of his fellow Polish émigré, Leopold Zborowski, photographed by Man Ray. The cliché of a Modigliani work that we see here is credited to Les Filles Libres, a magazine that Taiga cites specifically in a letter to Taiga as a model for the anthology. Next slide, please. Reproductions from the same process blocks in both anthologies also indicate the ways in which Devětsil economically reused process blocks. This is something I document in detail in my book manuscript, and it evinces a vast network of exchange of lending and loaning images for reproduction, not only with peers in Paris, but also at the Bauhaus, for instance, and in the Soviet Union. And if you could just cycle through the next 3 slides, just to give a few more examples of that. Here's another. Next slide, please. Thank you. The Eiffel Tower in here. Thank you. You can stop there. Thanks. The Revoluční Sborník was published in the Devětsil Group's own name, albeit under the new imprint of Večernice, or Evening Star, of the publisher Václav Vortel, who was still working at that time for the Komunistické nakladatelství, or the Communist Publishing House, in Prague. Revoluční Sborník was printed by Adolf Novotný in Žižkov, a neighborhood in Prague, a firm with which Vortel worked consistently. Život was printed by Politika, a major printing firm in Prague. Next slide, please. Any new process blocks that were not acquired through loan and needed to be produced in Prague for the printing of both anthologies were commissioned to Neubert and Sons, a foremost firm responsible for stunning imagery productions, and its insignia can be seen on the lower right-hand corner of many of the reproductions in the anthologies. Devětsil thus had at its disposal highly competent professionals to manifest its unconventional vision. And the fact that professional printers such as Adolf Novotný and Politika would work, I'm sorry, there's a dog visitor. And the fact that professional printers such as Adolf Novotný and Politika would work with avant-garde artists suggests a successful collaboration between the theoretical Art of Life project of Devětsil and the actual laborers willing to work with the available means of production to execute that vision. Through the essential collaboration with the printer, the volume successfully became a dynamic and physical embodiment of the Devětsil Art of Life approach in a post-World War that calls for revolution not via a violent or nationalist stance, but rather by embodying a new beauty, advertised in the Život anthology's cover as an embrace of all that is modern and industrial without losing the individual's humanity to the machine. Next slide, please. How much Devětsil understood this is highlighted by a photograph included at the very close of Život, on the inside of the back cover of the offices of Neubert and Son, that pictures, quote, the largest photographic reproduction device, end quote, in the whole of Czechoslovakia. The machine is not photographed to stand on its own. Rather, a man in a technician's coat poses at the viewfinder, underscoring the necessary collaboration between human and machine. And below the imaging caption, a note is added in parentheses to assert that Neubert and Sons was responsible for producing new process blocks for print in Život. In so many ways, Život is Devětsil's first bold statement of an art of life project in its textual as well as visual content and its very mode of production, and it underscores the propagandistic capacity of the magazine platform. Next slide, please. Where the anthologies Revoluční Sborník and Život mark a starting point for poetism, by comparison, a later work of Devětsil with the boat that carries tea and coffee perhaps visualizes the apex of poetism. Precisely simultaneous with Taiga's so-called typomontage, which are variously called typomontage compositions, typographic compositions, or typographic montages, he serially published the essay Words, Words, Words in a new architectural magazine, Horizont, also in 1928, in which he stated at the outset, quote, poetism, continuing in this line, that is from Stefan Mallarmé and F.T. Marinetti, and perfecting its possibilities, finally creates a poetry without words. Optical, oral, olfactory, and haptic poems broaden the domain of poetry and demonstrate a new and up to now unworked territory. Poetism creates a poetry for all senses, and that poetry is like a new structure. End quote. The typomontage expressly utilizes the available materials on hand in the typecase of the print shop in order to create abstract geometric compositions. These typically employ lines, rectangles, and circles, and it would be insufficient to call these images atextual, for they make use of the visual language that is intended to be read, and they also use the tools of the printing press and typecase towards this ends. They include letter forms, even if they do not typically include words. They are texts that simply demand a different kind of reading, a common call in a trans-European multilingual avant-garde milieu. I propose a theory of the typomontage that takes into account the mechanics of its making, its visual apparatus, and the ways in which it reflects some of the larger themes and subjects that preoccupied the Czech avant-garde in its poetic and artistic production. And again, collaboration with the printer was essential in realizing Taige's vision here. Earlier editions of Bibel's poetry, such as Lom, Break, had already been published by Kryl and Scotti, a fine press printer founded in the town of Novi Jičín in Moravia in 1909. But it is not until 1928, with the publication of both the first and second editions of With the Boat That Carries Tea and Coffee and the second edition of Zlom, that all published by the avant-garde Prague publishing house Odeon, that Taige becomes involved as the designer of Bibel's books and the typomontages are included. This collaboration offers evidence of a fruitful relationship between a professional print entity that was willing to work with artists of the avant-garde to manifest their artistic vision. Next slide, please. Kryl and Scotti maintained a small staff of about 20 and had a limited budget that restricted its capacity to working with new technologies. Irena Yashikova writes that when Karol Kryl and Ferdinand Scotti published the small printing operation from the widow of its former owner, they inherited, quote, old and miserable machines. One American Liberty press, one hand press, and one small format cylinder press with hand propulsion and outdated type, end quote. Early commissions came in the form of printed stationery for local schools and businesses, but Kryl and Scotti also worked with the renowned publisher of bibliographic book editions, Stare Zhizhe, which necessitated a refined practice despite a lack of, quote, perfect machines, good paper, suitable colors, and assortment of type, end quote. After a pause in operation during the First World War, during which both Kryl and Scotti served in the military, the printing press resumed operations, and in 1925 relocated, as Yashikova writes, quote, to a new, modern, light, extensive printing house, in which they were able to dedicate time to bibliographic work, aside from ordinary print jobs such as printing of posters, brochures, and commercial printing, end quote. Next slide, please. It is in this moment that a relationship also formalizes between this professional print operation and the avant-garde artists of Devětsil, and many other notable examples of Devětsil-related publications were printed by them, such as the Czech translation of Guillaume Apollinaires' Breast of Tiresias in 1926 and Charles Baudelaire's Fanfarlot in 1927, again both designed by Taige. The Devětsil books printed by Kryl and Scotti, typically published by Odeon, are arguably the most representative of the ways in which the avant-garde group employed the available technology of the printing press towards the projection of poetess principles, arguably in their purest and most final form. Next slide, please. Turning now to the contents of the earliest Devětsil anthologies again, and looking also at the later book production, we can see how this engagement between printers and artists materialized in the graphic layout of the printed page. Indeed, the importance of the printed object for showcasing the kind of art to which Devětsil aspired is highlighted in a quotation by Taige in one of his seminal essays, The Art of Today and Tomorrow, that appeared in the Revoluční Sporník as its concluding article and final word. In it, he compares the invention of the printing press to that of moving film as a way to think of the role of the machine that the machine plays in reproducing and propagating art outside the gallery or museum hall. And here's a quick quote. It has been rightly said that the discovery of the cinema is for us as important as the discovery of the printing press for the people of the Renaissance. Here, too, machine production disseminates art to its viewers. Yes, all of modern artistic culture consists and must consist of mechanical production. For today, it's the claim that mechanical production is part and parcel of any new artistic culture that I would like to consider closely. The printed publication was both a democratic outcome of this technologized new world and could likewise be a showcase for it. Taige saw typography as an art that met the new person in their homes and on the streets in the form of advertisement, book, and of course, magazine design. And he considered the editorial choices of the graphic designer as an effective means to propagate an art that it was thoroughly representative of his social and aesthetic ideals. that was life itself. Quote, a mechanical beauty that is the real work of the modern person, end quote. And next slide, please. To be sure, both the Devětsil issue of Život and Revoluční Sborník present an early articulation of a mechanical beauty that would be refined in later publications. But they are also an expression of poetism 2 years before the ism is methodically articulated in a poetess manifesto by Taige that upholds an embrace of a technologized future alongside a fascination with the natural and individual. And next slide, please. The cover of Život, which is credited to be a collaborative work of Taige, Krejcar, Bedřich Feuerstein, and Josef Šíma, is no doubt the best known example from the two 1922 anthologies with which to illustrate this. It showcases the juxtaposition of signifiers classical and modern, human-made, and natural. And I'll skip over a formal reading of the contents of this well-known montage for the sake of time today to point to just one thing, which has never been remarked upon in all the writing on the Život cover. That is, how the technology of the letterpress printing is laid bare through a deep impression in the printing of the backside of the cover, so that the black text from the inside of the anthology interrupts the picture plane on the front, showing through in its mirror image. This inscrutable text brings another dimension to the cover, which is now inundated by letter forms that draw attention to the process of letterpress printing and the textual impression that it makes. This is really only ascertainable when viewing the anthology in person, though hopefully you can sort of glimpse what I mean here, but is also hard to ignore once you see it, becoming an integral, if inadvertent, element of the cover art. Next slide, please. The cover of the Revoluční Sborník, in contrast, is a simple design that employs only type and one geometric element. The word Devětsil appears in all capital letters above a solid disk, and Prague 1922 below, also in capitals but a different, smaller font. And next slide, please. For the purposes of this talk, it is the title page that deserves a closer look, specifically at the circle, not a disk, following in Jichtelman's differentiation, printed near the center of the page. Next slide, please. 4 slender lines are visible on the north, south, east, and west circumference of the circle, where the paper is uninked, clearly indicating that this geometric shape was composed by assembling 4 distinct pieces of rounded type, and thus laying bare the hand of the compositor. As with the text that pushes through the cover of Život, evincing the process of production, this circle, comprised of 4 rounded metal type pieces, highlights the hand of the typesetter, who has creatively produced the apparently requested circle from the available materials in the job case. Next slide, please. And by the time of the publication of With the Boat That Carries Tea and Coffee and the 1928 edition of Zlom, we can see clearly that Taige was thinking about the job case and the typesetter in his designs. Next slide. We have evidence of his hands-on involvement through a series of sketches for the designs that are ultimately included in the 1928 edition of Zlom. And these show how Taige was thinking through his initial designs and conveying that to the printers. There are extensive handwritten notes all over the sketches that provide insights into how he conceived of the architecture of the page with regards to space, size, and color. Next slide, please. Moving in conclusion to a close look at one page from With the Boat That Carries Tea and Coffee, I will break down how units of movable type were conceived by Taige to create his typomontages and how they are composed, as was explained in the catalog for Gefesselte Blick, a seminal design exhibition in 1930 Stuttgart, quote, from elements that are on hand in essentially any printing house, lines, balks, borders, end quote. The montages make exclusive use of the materials already on hand at the printing press, notably precluding the expense and additional labor of producing new process blocks, and their dynamic composition from these materials encourages a new way of reading that is almost narrative. Next slide, please. The typomontages in With the Boat That Carries Tea and Coffee are all printed in 2 colors, black and pink, featuring circles and heavy rectangles that sit vertically and horizontally on the page, which are intersected with more delicate lines of various weight. Next slide. In the first edition, there are also hand-colored elements, which renders each copy a unique object, which I discuss at further length in my book, but I don't have time to broach here. And next slide, please. For now, I would just like to give special attention to the typomontage that illustrates the section of With the Boat That Carries Tea and Coffee that bears the same name of the book's title, inasmuch as it both highlights the formal aspects of the genre and illustrates the larger theme of travel underscored in the book's poems. The images capture a schematized representation of a boat at sea through the sole use of lines, circles, rectangles, and squares, as well as letter forms. In the case of this typomontage, the letters in fact spell out full words. We have jazz and York, or otherwise clearly signify a concrete meaning. For example, the letters S, J, B, and Z that appear around a series of arrows pointing up and down, left and right, indicate that they are meant to be the 4 points on a compass, north, south, east, and west. Additionally, an upside-down V represents the sail of a boat. A large pink square to the left of the compass appears to be the hull of the boat, as it is imprinted with the word York, the name of the boat by which Bibel traveled to Java. From the middle of this pink square, a slender black line rises, supported at the base from a thicker black rectangle running perpendicular and capped with 2 smaller perpendicular lines, as well as a pink rectangle, appearing to be the mast of the boat. This typomontage and the others that appear in With the Boat That Carries Tea and Coffee, when considered in their painted and unpainted version, and read formally for the ways in which they employ the available materials of the printer, show how the technologies of print available to Devětsil, and with which Taiga was well familiar, had a direct influence on the art that was made. I have offered this example here, as well as the earliest of the Devětsil anthologies, to briefly illustrate how integral was the role of the printer, and as such, how essential the collaboration between the artist and print practitioner in creating the avant-garde vision of poetism. Thank you.